to dispatch 14 British Army tanks. Kyiv is now seeking around 300 tanks to tackle the Russian counteroffensive. Germany's under increasing pressure to authorise the release of its Leopard 2 battle tanks. And American singer David Crosby has died aged 81 following a long illness. He co-founded two rock bands in the 1960s, the Byrds and Crosby, Stills and Nash. His career also saw him achieve the rare feat of being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, not once, but twice. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom with the briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now first this morning, the results of the latest GB News People's Poll are out. And following the government's seismic decision to block the Scottish Government's gender reform bill, it's no surprise that we start there. Fascinatingly, there's a lot of ambivalence. Just 34% of the public support the government's blocking of this controversial bill, compared to 25% who are opposed to that decision. Perhaps most interestingly of all, 19% neither support or oppose that decision, while 9% don't want to say. A great deal of confusion there. Where there's less ambiguity is on the specific issue of whether or not the public views 16 and 17-year-olds as old enough to change gender, as the Scottish bill reduces the age someone can apply for gender recognition certificates from 18 to 16. Well, 61% of Brits oppose that. Now, turning to the state of the parties, there's been no big shifts. Support for the Conservatives remains at a historic low, 21%. That's more than 20 points behind the Labour Party. But might the announcements that we've heard this week, might a more fervent approach to devolution, might the levelling up funding that we heard so much about yesterday, might this be able to move the dial? Or, frankly, will the economic headwinds be simply too strong to counteract? Well, let's discuss this in greater detail now. Jonathan Portes is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London. And Jonathan, first of all, I was fascinated yesterday to look at the resignation of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. I was looking at the headlines down in New Zealand, where there is a high inflation, the mortgage rates have shot up, newspapers are talking about a crime wave, and I'm just wondering, is basically every country in the developed world facing the same sort of headwinds?
Well, certainly the cost of living crisis is certainly a European phenomenon and to some extent a global phenomenon, right? What is happening is the result of primarily of higher energy prices and higher food prices post-pandemic, and in part because of the conflict in Ukraine. So there very much is a sort of short-term crisis, which is primarily the result of global factors. But then on top of that, I think what's happening here is this realization that as well as the short-term factors, we've also had something of a lost decade economically, that first austerity and then Brexit have led to this sort of period of prolonged slow growth in the economy, in productivity, in real wages, at the same time as the quality and sustainability of our public services have been eroded. And that has sort of, some of us have been talking about this for some time, but this sort of penny has begun to drop rather more widely. So I think we have a combination of short-term and long-term economic factors, many of which, of course, are global, but some of which have been building up here for quite some time.
The UK economy has underperformed, for example, the US economy. But I think it's less clear as to whether or not the UK economy has underperformed the EU economy, or specifically the Eurozone economy, which had slower growth rates right through up until the pandemic. From 2010 to 2020, the UK economy was much faster than the EU average growth for those developed countries.
It wasn't much faster. Within some sort of margin of error for GDP. What is more apparent, though, is if you look at sort of things which actually matter to households, so real wages, median household incomes, and in particular the sort of incomes of people at 25% or as a sort of third, fourth, fifth deciles of the income distribution, that's been considerably worse than lots of sort of comparable countries, even when overall GDP growth has been roughly comparable. So you'll have seen those charts showing how we have, although our overall GDP growth has actually been quite similar to France, if you look at sort of median living standards, we've performed rather less well. And then, of course, look at what's happening to public services at the same time.
I suppose, no doubt, housing has a large role to play there. To what extent will the Levelling Up Fund that we saw £2.1 billion yesterday announced, sloshing around the country, performing, whether it's town centre sprucing up projects or perhaps more meaningfully transportation projects too, might this be able to shift the dial?
Well, I mean, a lot of these projects are good, worthwhile things at a local level. So I don't think we shouldn't diss them. On the other hand, if I look at my local area, Islington, which has some of the, has lots of relatively well-off people like me, but also has a lot of poverty and deprivation and quite a lot of wards that are among the 10 or 20% most deprived in the country. We've seen central government funding slashed by 70% over the last 10 years. And it's not that different in nearby Camden. Now, Camden, which of course is Keir Starmer's constituency, has got £7 million from the Levelling Up Fund for, as I understand it, bike lanes. Now, that may very well be a good thing that Camden should be able to build some more bike lanes. I have no problem with that. But if you think that is going to compensate for the very, very large cuts that Islington and Camden have had to make to, for example, children's social services, adult social care, and so on, I think that's clearly not going to be what happens. So I think the Levelling Up Fund, while a lot of these projects on an individual level are very welcome, they're only really scratching the surface of what's needed in terms of the core public services that are needed at the local level.
And yet the political criticism from the Labour Party yesterday was that too much of this money was going to London and the South East. That was, of course, before any population division was done in, because on a per capita basis, most money went to Wales, I believe. But on a non-per capita basis, just in a simple cash going where amount, most went to London and the South East. I suppose that's a clever political play for the Labour Party to make, but it does rather go against the point that you were just making.
Absolutely. I think it's really quite a dumb criticism, frankly, because the idea that everybody in London and the South East is well off and all Northerners are poor and subsist on a diet of, meat pies or whatever, it's nonsense. Poverty and deprivation are spread around the country. As I said, my own local area has some of the richest and well-off people in the country, and obviously I'm perfectly well off, but it also has significant areas of poverty and deprivation, and that's true of many local authorities. Whether you go to Bradford, Birmingham, the Manchester suburb of some of the Manchester suburbs are among the poorest in the country, and some are among the richest in the country. It's true all over the country. So the test is not whether the funds go to a particular region, but who they're going to and what they're actually going to achieve.
Certainly. Really, really interesting stuff there. Well, Jonathan Portis, thank you so much for joining us this morning and talking through those big issues that the country faces. Really appreciate your time. Now, another big issue, of course, one that's rumbling through Parliament as we speak. Well, at the end of this month, it will be 3 years since the United Kingdom officially left the European Union. And yet thousands upon thousands of EU laws remain on the country's statute books. 4,000 in total. Last week, we discussed this very topic with the former Brexit Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this week, we're heading from the Commons to the Lords to get insight from that side of the House. I'm delighted to be joined by Baroness Foster of Oxton, Jacqueline Foster, the Conservative peer and former MEP. First of all, thank you so much for joining us this morning. There's a lot of concern among people who voted Leave that the House of Lords behaves very differently to the House of Commons on the issue of Brexit, and that there might be some difficulty for the repeal of all of these EU laws going through the House of Lords.
Well, I hope not, because the mandate was quite clear from the beginning. And it's true that there are a huge number of people in the House of Lords who were vehemently opposed to Brexit. But just to give you a little bit more clarification, there were actually 58,000 regulations or laws that came through from, I think, 1991 that we took into statute. So I think people like me, we always knew it was a mammoth task. And I think when some sort of said, once we leave and, you signed on the dotted line, we can get everything sorted out in 12 months, that was never going to be the case when you're looking at the legislation. So to be fair to government, I think where it's a great frustration to me is, of course, COVID, that 2 years pretty well, COVID, where people actually weren't in the office where they need to be in the civil service to deal and really look at these regulations to see what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. I think that really held that up. And this is why, we're still in the throes really of trying to get clarification. To be fair, government have moved a lot of these regulations into what are called statutory instruments. And they've been going through in the House of Lords as well in the House of Commons. But there's still a lot of big stuff to do. And while there are a lot of regulations, the industry I was in, for example, in aviation, a lot of those regulations have an international dimension. And I think there'll be a lot of this stuff in there on whether it's security or traffic management or passenger rights or whatever, actually, which was very good and solid stuff. There'll still be some regulations, and a lot of them, where Parliament will want to actually amend them and maybe make them more focused on the UK, I think, which is quite right, and it's what we've said we'll do.
Yes, I think everyone understands that to throw out every single law would be perhaps not the most sensible thing to do. Some of these things underpin the way in which the country works as things go. It needs to be a more measured process than that. The EU repeal bill, the revocation, the retention of EU law bill, which has that repeal clause within it, of course, passed the Commons on Wednesday. There was not a significant Tory rebellion, although there were reports of one. I wonder, from your seat in the House of Lords, does endorsement from the Commons like that, with no significant rebellion, does that give that bill more moral authority when it reaches your House?
Well, it should do. And I think what I do agree with, of course, I think we've given it now to the end of 2023 to try and get this all sorted out. And I know there are others, and they actually want to spend time and actually have then more scrutiny and whatever, which is extremely time consuming. And as I've said, a lot of this is actually a technical tidy up. To make sure the stuff on the statute book is current, and it needs to be obviously focused really on where we are on the UK. And as I said, Tom, most of these laws actually will remain the same. They're very technical. They go through financial service. They go through a whole raft of things. So I don't think there's any excuse for procrastination. I know there will be some, certainly in the House of Lords, who will push back on this. There have been some in the House of Commons. But I'm afraid that's not going to wash with me, because we had made, we'd made a promise. We'd said this is what we're going to do. We knew it would take time to transpose into all of this, and we need to get this economy cracking. And this is the way to do it. If I may just make one small point, I think a point Jacob Rees-Mogg made when he was a minister, in actual fact, I actually support, because the civil service need to be in situ when we are looking through all of these regulations, when we're looking through all of these laws. And you cannot deal with legislation very often from home looking at a computer. When I was in charge for transport on maritime aviation, rail and road, of putting together getting through all the primary legislation, for nearly 20 years. You have to be in the room. You have to be debating this. You have to have the legal side of all of this, as well as industry and everything else. And I think that's not helpful. So I certainly supported him in his call to make sure that the senior civil servants get people, back on the shop floor, basically, in those government offices. And I think then we will be able to speed up, I think, with much more, really be able to look at it, because people are there and they're actually working and interacting with each other.
Really interesting point there, of course, because this week we've seen just how low the attendance levels are for so many government departments. It really is quite shocking. It's something we will return to, no doubt, on this programme as the weeks go on. But for now, Jacqueline Foster, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. Really appreciate your insights and your time. Now, on to the National Health Service. Of course, strikes continue to divide the nation. Ambulance workers are announcing these fresh set of dates this morning. Of course, nurses have been out as well. But interestingly, I've been reading some of the most fascinating commentary around the NHS this week. It's not an analysis of where things are now, but where things could have been. Yes, Christian Niemitz of the Institute of Economic Affairs has written an alternative history whereby NHS policy changed fairly dramatically under the coalition. Of course it didn't. The health service is basically under the same structure as it has always been since the 1940s. But Christian Niemitz has written this, The Universal Healthcare Without the NHS, an alternative history. And I'm delighted to be joined by Christian Niemitz now. Thank you for joining us and coming into the studio, indeed. What is the basic thesis here in terms of how the model of the NHS, in your view, might have changed under the coalition, might have still delivered universal healthcare, free at the point of use, but under a very different model?
Well, the starting point for this article was simply the observation that a lot of our neighbour countries are facing the same challenges. They've also gone through COVID, they've also had a bad flu season and all the rest of it. They also have a grim winter in parts, but they don't have the problems that we have here. And that's simply because they have better healthcare systems. And I was asked to comment on the current winter crisis, what could be done about it. And I've always said I can't really comment on that. It's not that I have any ideas for a quick fix. It's more of a I wouldn't start from here. That's my position. So then I was asked, well, where would you start? And therefore I started outlining where I would start from, ideally in the past.
It's absolutely fascinating to read, particularly the early part of this. You sort of say, well, in this alternative history, Cameron didn't really know what his policy ideas was. He commissions this sort of review run by one of Obama's people, and it ends up recommending that we take on the Dutch system of healthcare, or something very similar to it.
Yes, and that's because that person, even though this is a fictitious report, that person actually exists, that former Obama advisor. He has written a book about, I think, 2 years ago, where he, I think it's literally called which healthcare system is the best in the world, something like that. And he does come to the conclusion, he doesn't want to say this one or that one, doesn't want to nominate a single one, but he has a top tier, and the Netherlands are very much in that. And I thought, well, okay, that's a country which spends about the same amount on healthcare as Britain does, far better outcomes, quite comparable in other ways. Therefore, would it really be such a radical thought experiment to say, well, what if we had a healthcare system like they have?
And it's fascinating, you sort of go through the political machinations of what would have happened. The Deputy Prime Minister at the time, Nick Clegg, being half Dutch himself, sort of wrapping himself in a Dutch flag, saying, look, it's almost xenophobic if you oppose the Dutch system of healthcare. It's quite a comedic piece. But there are always these people that say that really what you're trying to do is Americanise the system, no matter what you propose happens to it.
Yes.
And how did that play out in your thought experiment?
Well, yeah, that's why you have to emphasise that if you're talking about an insurance-based system, a social insurance system, universal private insurance system, whatever you want to call it, you have to emphasize that this already exists. It's not some radical idea that some think tank nerd has come up with. It does exist in a number of countries, the Netherlands being perhaps a particularly good example, not the only one, but certainly a starting point. And that's the part that you have to emphasize. Under different circumstances, I would say, let's not make it too much about the specifics of this country or that country. Let's just talk about what kind of health system we want to have. It's just that when you talk about alternatives to the NHS, your opponents will always say, oh, you want a system like in the US. Do you know how many people face medical bankruptcies and all that? And it's just a lot easier if you can point out there are no medical bankruptcies in the Netherlands. Doesn't exist there. They don't have an uninsured population. And by just pointing out that kind of system, it's not a super radical idea. It does exist. It has good outcomes. And that's why I emphasized that point in the article.
At a very basic level, in the Netherlands, what happens is if you don't earn a lot of money, the government pays for your healthcare. If you do earn a lot of money, you sort of get your own insurance out. That's basically the system.
Well, yeah, everyone has private insurance and you're obliged to get it. It's just that if you can't afford to pay your premium, then the government will pay it for you. But nonetheless, you would be with the same health insurer as your rich neighbour. It's not that there's a rich people's luxury health insurer and a poor people's Ryanair insurance. No, they would all offer roughly the same standard, and it's just that some people pay their own premium, namely those who can. Those are the majority of the population can afford to pay their premiums, but some can't, and in those cases, it's going to be paid for them. And the health insurers cannot discriminate on the basis of risk status, on the basis of your individual health status. They can't say, no, you're too risky because you have these pre-existing conditions or something. They have to accept you.
So why, in your view, does that run better than the NHS, where one might argue that it's potentially more simple, more efficient to have just one provider of healthcare across the country? Well,
yeah, but that would be the argument. That would be like saying the Soviet Union was more efficient because they only had one car company, rather than having this competition between dozens of them. No, I think healthcare is ultimately not that different from other goods. It's generally the case that state monopolies don't work particularly well because you don't have a competitive process, you don't have freedom of choice between very different offers. I think healthcare is ultimately not that different. It's, of course, a much more complex product than most of the things that we buy on a day-to-day basis. But broadly speaking, the principle is still the same. You want a marketplace where you, the consumer, are the king, the customer is king, and where if you're not happy with performance of a healthcare provider, a health insurer, whoever the actor is, that you have the option to switch to somebody, some alternate, some competitor who does things in a completely different way.
And fascinatingly, we're always told that the NHS doesn't have enough money in the United Kingdom, despite the extra tens of billions that have been poured into it in the last few years. Your assessment is the Netherlands spends about the same amount on healthcare, but with much better outcomes.
Yes, as a proportion of GDP, it's almost exactly the same as here, or at least it was before COVID. We might, in the meantime, have actually overtaken them.
Wow. And they don't have winter crises?
Well, they have an increase in demand, but nothing that they would describe as a crisis.
Really, really interesting stuff. I have to say, the two pieces that you have written, the first on sort of the politics of getting to that system, and the second on really what people felt when it was implemented, because people were almost surprised in your thought experiment that they didn't have to pay out of pocket and that there weren't these sort of scare stories from the United States. Really, really fascinating two pieces there that you've written. I do recommend anyone who is interested to Google Dr. Niemitz's thought experiments. Whether you agree or disagree, it's certainly a conversation that is worth having in the context. On The Briefing, coming up, it's Esther and Phil. So look forward to everything they are discussing today. Have a lovely weekend, and I'll be back on Monday morning with yet more politics to discuss here on The Briefing from 9:30.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you.
GB News will always stay honest,
balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless and sometimes serious, much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even some ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps. On your smart speaker,